Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. Nearly forgot what it was then. It's a Monday. It's the 18th, isn't it? It's the 18th, 2021. I'm Richard Vobes, and this is the Listen with Vobes, in which we read some old books to young people. Young in heart, at least. Young in mind. That's the aim, and we're halfway through Children of the Archbishop by Norman Collins. We've only got about a third of it to go now, and we're thoroughly enjoying the story. And it's lovely to see everybody out there all coming along as we go live at 4 o'clock each weekday. So hello to TurboStream, hello to you, sir, to lovely Julia, who's had an issue with styrofoam balls. A lap tray busted. Oh, I see what you mean. You mean the tray that goes on your lap. You have a tray with a cushion, a lap tray. Yeah, I wondered what that was. And they've just gone, poof. What a nightmare. See, these cheap and nasty things, it's not worth it in the end. You're better with a dog or a cat with the tray strapped to it. And as long as it's obedient and doesn't get up when the tray starts getting warm, as the heat of the soup's gone through the bowl and through the thin veneer of the tray, and then warmed the back of the cat, and it's gone, ah! And the soup, and well, anyway. Also, Holly & Co. is there. Good morning from our cloud-covered day. Tut-tut, looks like rain. Oh. Justine Jones, Billabong O'Neill, John F., Cooper68, The Green Man, James Poulton, Audrey Forbes, Susan Luca, Dave over yonder, Philip Hammond and Mary, and Michael White. Young at heart, you're so young at heart, says the lovely Julia. I'm not even going to attempt to sing it. And Audrey says, every time, Richard, you say Norman Collins, I think he's going to say Norman Collier. No, not going to say that. Definitely not. The lap tray was one of 3 we got for Christmas in 2019. Oh, so it's only done a year. 2019, 2020. Golly. So it's just out of the guaranteed period. So you can't take it back. And it's done what it's, this is the problem with things these days. As ever, I have got some lovely, ginger and lemon hot drink in a cup. By the way, these marvellous cups are available at theboardexplorer.com. They have an accurate picture of my head and blank face that I have first thing in the morning when I wake up. Huh? Have I got to do a video? Yes, son, you certainly have. And it's got the words Board Explorer on it, which, just adds that little bit of finesse. Awfulness. No. Anyway, enough of this nonsense. I hope you're all well. I hope you're doing good things. It's a couple of minutes past, so we better get cracking, I guess. We're on chapter, XL1, 41. We managed to work out how that was. By the way, Mission Control has moved. Have you noticed? Mission Control now? Where is it gone? I now am back to 2 little desks. I know you're all interested in the technical malarkey, so I'll show you. The desk now is just 2 little ones like that, which is nice. One of these days, I'll work out how to do all of this on my phone. Won't be as fun, but probably be more efficient. You need to have a word with Father Christmas, Julia. Yes, that's very true. Dudley Sawyer says, cripes, I'm lost in time and space. When is it? What year? It's 2037. We have conquered a lot of things. COVID was a thing of the past now. The second ice age has come. We got rid of global warming and all that nonsense because we've set our fridges to work with solar panels on their backs, and somehow camels are involved on a treadmill in Eurasia. So it's amazing what technology can happen. But in the meantime, if we beam back to 2021 on January the 18th, you'll find that some bald bloke's about to read a book. The bench seemed harder and sharper than it had done when Ginger had laid down on it the night before. And colder. Even though the morning wasn't exactly cold, there was certainly a pretty bleak sort of draught blowing up between the planking. It came through in long, cold slices, like streaky ice. "Time I was getting back," Ginger told himself. "I must have overslept a bit." There wasn't a single important-looking person about in the streets yet, but London was getting a more lived-in appearance every moment. Newspaper sellers were undoing the tarpaulin wrappers of their kiosks, and a small cafe in Villiers Street was taking the shutters down. "I'm late," Ginger told himself. "I've got to hurry." Sorry if my microphone is just clipping there. It might be a bit too loud. The words were still ringing in his ears as he reached the Strand. And that was where things became difficult. Because by daylight, everything looked different. He paused for a moment to take his bearings. He still had a vague general idea that he should be going northwards. But in his anxiety of moving, he turned right. And that was fatal. It brought him into Chandos Street and then through Henrietta Street into Covent Garden. Here it was all cabbages and potatoes and bunches of bananas, and it just showed how far off his rightful track he really was. That's interesting, isn't it? You think of, Covent Garden, as a tourist trap with people doing statues and street theatre with people climbing onto tall giraffe unicycles juggling fire sticks, and there's the opera house, and then there's all the trendy clothing that nobody can actually afford, and then when they buy it they wish they hadn't bought it because they could have got it, online or in Tesco's cheaper. However, that's what we think of today. Well, it might not be what we think of, it's what I think of. And somewhere I've got a book, not in here, I think it's in the other room, on Covent Garden, the history of, tells you all about it. But luckily I didn't bring it in here to bore you with it. Instead, I needed a slurp of the old drink just to get me through. Anyway, there we are, Covent Garden. Here it was all cabbages and potatoes and bunches of bananas, and it just showed how far off the right track he really was. Doubling back again, he made his way up Garrick Street and across Seven Dials, still looking for St. Paul's Cathedral, or Paddington, or whatever there was that might have been all those lights and the nice people the previous night. Piccadilly Circus, wasn't it? But he could see that he was wrong, and he was getting thoroughly frightened by now. "You're never alone with the Strand," says Audrey Forbes, showing your age there, Audrey. "Richard, you need to stop fiddling with your equipment. I'm so sorry. It's the only pleasure I get these days in lockdown." And Alan Sandell says that Villiers Street was on my route to work. A lot of character went out of the window when it was pedestrianised and done up. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. What a shame. Who remembers Flowers Are Lovely? Oh, yes. If you used to go down in the Worthing, I remember going into Worthing and there was always a woman there going, "Flowers are lovely, dear. Flowers are lovely." And then you'd get the little sort of dowdy woman almost in rags with a sort of thing over her head, tiny little woman going around with something she'd picked off the grass wrapped in silver paper going, "Lucky Heather, dear. Lucky Heather." And I remember she came up to me one day, "Lucky Heather, dear." And I just said to her, "Look at you. It's not very lucky, is it? What luck has that given you? You're out there pulling it off the grass, wrapped up in some natty old silver paper. Lucky Heather, dear." No thanks, love. They were the days. "I have yet to do the London sights," says TurboStream, despite my dad hailing from London. Yes, well, no, not the London sights are not what they used to be, you know. And Justine Jones says, "I remember the flower sellers of Worthing in Montague Place Street," just as I was recalling myself. Anyway, so he got rather frightened. Yes, I'm not at all surprised. Because the nearer that Ginger got to the Euston Road, the less it did look like the part of London for which he was searching, he decided to ask someone. So he chose a crossing sweeper. The man was a bit of a swell in his own line of business. You can tell that at a glance. His little three-wheeled handcart, painted bright yellow and with a stiff bristled broom and the long-handled shovel resting upon it, might just have turned out of a livery yard. But he was friendly all right, and he knew all there was to know about getting across London. He might even have made a special study of the Euston Road to Putney problem. He was so certain. "Take a bus 14, he said. "A bus 14 was what you want. Simple as that. Just take 14 bus and it will put you down on your own doorstep. 14 bus is the answer, mate." It was about this time that a rather awkward interview was beginning inside the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital. Mr. Dawlish had just been shown into Dr. Trump's study and was clearing his throat in readiness. One of my boys seems to be missing, he had begun. Ginger thanked the crossing sweeper very politely. He didn't stay long, however, because his luck changed suddenly. There was a number 14 bus drawing up nearly opposite, and nipping round the back of a taxi, he caught it just as it was moving away. But this time he wasn't going to risk any funny stuff from the conductor. He just held out his money, all that he had left of it, and said, "5-penny one." Then, finally, the bus stopped and the conductor came up on the top again to charge the board in front. He seemed surprised to find Ginger still there. "This is as far as we go, son," he said. "But this isn't Putney," Ginger told him. He was suddenly cautious and wary again. "Nobody says it was, son," the conductor answered. "You come the wrong way, that's what you've done. You stay where you are and we'll take you back again." But Ginger's nerves were all on edge and he broke out suddenly. "Give me my money back," he said fiercely. "You just give me my money back." The conductor, however, had met boys like Ginger before. He was a Hornsey man himself, and he knew the sort of tricks they got up to down Hornsey way. He didn't even lose his temper. "Like my mate to fetch a policeman," he said. "You wait here, sonny." But that put Ginger in a difficult position. Getting a policeman was one thing that he wanted to avoid, but he wasn't going to let the conductor know. "I'll get him myself," Ginger said. "See if I don't," he replied. It was only when he actually set foot on the pavement, thereby surrendering his last claim to all possibility of a free return journey, that he said something that, just for a moment, made the conductor wonder whether perhaps Ginger was telling the truth after all. "Where is this, please?" Ginger asked. "It's Hornsey, my lad," the conductor answered, taken unawares. "As you know it is," he added, as he recovered himself. But Ginger was too much confused by now to be listening. This was a disaster, sheer, irreparable disaster. Breakfast time over, and no breakfast inside him, and with all his money gone, and now he was marooned somewhere on the other side of London in a place that he'd never heard of. Because there was nowhere else to go where he could think quietly, Ginger went across to the public lavatory that stood opposite. And he had just reached the conclusion that there was only one thing to do, and that was to give himself up and ask to be arrested, when he became aware of the sound of running feet. They were peculiarly noisy feet, and amid the echoing tiles of the public lavatory, they sounded like nothing less than a cavalry charge. The next moment, he was being borne down upon. At the double came a horde of ruffians, all more or less his own age and dressed in dirty-looking flannel trousers. But unlike him, they weren't at least despondent. Most of them had sandwiches and oranges, and some had squeakers and paper teasers as well. and it was obvious that they were cheerfully and gloriously out of control. Behind them, some 25 yards in the rear, but travelling fast, came a young sporting-looking curate in a sports coat and flannels. There was a slightly breathless and apprehensive look on his face as he rounded the corner, and no wonder. It was from St. Botolph's Hornsey annual outing that had just arrived, and the curate was supposed to be in charge of it. The idea of visiting a lavatory, of crowding every possible pleasurable sensation into the day that promised to be all too brief, had evidently occurred to them all at once. The lavatory was now packed solid, and a moment later the breathless curate appeared in the doorway. "Come along, boys," he said pleadingly. "Come along, we're just off. Button up, no loiterers." Even then, Ginger had not reckoned on the organising energy of the young curate. Before Ginger knew what was happening to him, he was being hustled out of the lavatory and into a bus marked private, and that was just standing outside. He tried to explain the mistake, twice, in fact. The first time was on the step, just as he was getting in, but the curate simply pushed him in sharply up the stairs and told him that he would see about it later. And the second was when he'd actually taken his place, but on that occasion a shrill and piercing sort of toy siren was being enthusiastically blown in the next seat, and the curate couldn't hear what Ginger was saying. He thought indeed that he was apologising for having kept him waiting outside. The curate therefore merely patted Ginger on the head and went back inside again. He was new to St. Botolph's, this curate, and it was his first annual outing, and he was anxious to make the best possible impression all round. After his second attempt at explanation, Ginger reckoned that there was nothing for it than to go through with the whole thing. In any case, it was not like an ordinary bus. It was a private one, and it was a sightseeing tour. Even if he'd had wanted to get off, he couldn't have done so. So he just sat on. All the while, around him, paper bags and cardboard attaché cases were opened, and the first serious eating of the jaunt began. Meanwhile, the curate, who had chosen the seat nearest the door, was checking up on the numbers. At a third attempt, he gave it up and put the list away. "It says 37. I'll make it 38, he told himself. "But what's the matter? Better than losing one of the little beasts." He broke off. "Now, chaps," he said, in a voice that he hoped would combine authority with good fellowship. "Go easy there. No ragging. Penknives away. Remember, we're St. Botolph's." There was a policeman standing outside the gates of the zoo. By now, the news of Ginger's disappearance was known to the force, and the police outside the zoo had all the particulars. He was, in fact, on the lookout. What's more, he was a young man anxious for promotion and ready to pounce at sight. But what happened? Instead of producing the handcuffs, he took 2 smart paces to the rear to avoid being trampled on and let the procession, with Ginger within arm's reach, surge right under his nose. Not that he ever knew, of course. Standing upright and foursquare upon the curbstone, he continued to keep a skilled and roving eye open for a missing boy, aged 13, 5'2", 6 inches, 6 stone 5, red hair, freckled nose. By now, Ginger felt himself so much one of the party, a regular St. Botolph boy, in fact, that he could certainly have remained with them until closing time if it had not been for the unfortunate incident of the one-way turnstile. The turnstile was placed in the thickness of a hedge, dividing the zoo from the rest of London, and in consequence there was an air of mystery and enticement as to what lay outside. At the mere sight of the turnstile, the zoo suddenly became dull and commonplace, and the streets wonderful and rich in their surprises. Ginger was first to pass through the turnstile, and as he stood agreeably surveying the stream of traffic, the car park, the waiting taxis, the curved and He stood there agreeably surveying the stream of traffic, the car park, the waiting taxis, the curve and sunny road. Then the awful thing happened. He wanted to go back, but the turnstile wouldn't budge. If it had been a prison gate, it wouldn't have been more... If it had been a prison gate, it couldn't have been more massive and unyielding. And now he saw that he had overestimated the road. The traffic, after all, was just ordinary, and the taxis hadn't even got their engines running, and there wasn't a jeweller's shop or a public house in sight. In fact, nothing worth looking at. Already, in retrospect, the zoo seemed a vanished Eden, a corner of fairyland glimpsed for a moment in a dream, only to be snatched away and lost forever. But once he had reached the Prince Albert Road on the far side, he found something really worth looking at. It was a daffodil and vermilion ice cream wagon with the words, "Luigi Rapoto, pure cream ices," on the side. "I think we've met Luigi once before, have we not?" he says with a grin. I've lost my place. Here we go. And it had broken down. The bonnet of the little car was up, and the man in the dirty white overall was fiddling with the engine. The presence of Ginger, standing appreciatively on the curbside in the sunshine, appeared to irritate him. "Hey, get along with you," he said. "You're standing in the light." Ginger moved back a pace, and then he stationed himself again. Any further would have been unthinkable. The spectacle was far too fascinating. But after a few moments' contemplation, Ginger decided that the little fat man was not very good at mending motor cars, and evidently the fat man came to the same conclusion about the same time. For bringing the bonnet down with a crash, he thrust one arm into the driving apartment and began to push. And it was then that Mr. Rapoto had an idea. "Hey, lazy boy," he said. "Don't you want to see me breaking my back? Give us a hand. Push. Come on, push me hard." That was all Ginger needed. It was acknowledgement. It cured that lonely and unwanted feeling. He pushed so hard, in fact, that Mr. Rapoto had to do was steer, and with no pushing to do himself, Mr. Rapoto's spirits rose. He steered with one hand and waved to passers-by with the other. Soon he was singing as well. It was fun pushing. Ginger enjoyed it, but it was hard work too. He was out of breath. Then Mr. Rapoto stopped singing. "Here we are," he said. "We got it there. This is the garage." With that, he pulled on the handbrake, and Ginger bumped his head. Dunk. But Mr. Rapoto was his friend now, his guardian. "Never mind your head," he said, consoling him. "I'll give you a cornet. I'll give you the cornet and the wafer. The cornet and the wafer, because you are pusher so hard." He kept patting Ginger on the back with his large, hot hand. But he was still quick to take offence, and he was obviously disappointed, affronted even, by Ginger's answer. "Please, I'd rather have the penny," was what Ginger said. Mr. Rapoto stopped patting him. "You a Jewer boy?" he demanded. "You only worker for the money? What do you want the penny for? To buy ice cream, huh?" "Please, I want it for my bus fare," Ginger told him. "I've got to go to Putney." "And you? And if I give you no a penny, you walker?" Mr. Reporter asked. "You walker from here to a Putney?" Ginger nodded. "Yes, sir." It was then that the Mediterranean magnificence of Mr. Rapoto's nature revealed itself. "I'll go to the Putney too. I drive you there," he said. "As soon as the car she goes, I drive you, and I give you the cornet. And the wafer, I do everything. You are a good boy. You push it very hard." He paused. "I drive the vicar once," he confided. Yay, jumped about like a monkey. He smashed everything, nasty vicar. It was late by the time Mr. Reporto had delivered Ginger on his own doorstep. The whole day had passed by then, and it was evening again. Ginger made his way back into the hospital by the fire escape route. It was not so easy without Spud to help him, but there was a drain pipe that came in very handy, and Ginger had become pretty good at drain pipes. There was a bit of trouble with the window because it was locked on the inside. Spud was usually a heavy sort of sleeper, but tonight he might have been waiting for Ginger to turn up. At the second rap on the window pane, he was out of bed. But though prompt, he was not comforting. "Where've you been?" he asked. "You ain't half going to cop it?" "Gone," was all that Ginger answered. He was tired, and he didn't want to explain everything immediately, but Spud was not so easily put off. "They got the police looking out for you," he went on. "How'd you get past them?" Ginger began peeling off his jersey. "Shut up, or I'll bash you," he said. Spud shut up. It was nice hearing Ginger say that. It meant a lot to Spud, having his friend back again. And Ginger was asleep a minute later, fast asleep, in so deep and dreamless a sleep that he did not wake up until the door of the dormitory opened and Dr. Trump appeared, dormitory register in one hand, electric torch in the other. Mr. Dawlish edged in just behind him. Dr. Trump was highly professional. He did not, as Mr. Dawlish had done, rely on a quick glimpse in the pale light that came seeping through the open doorway. Instead, he moved carefully from bed to bed, shining the torch like a searchlight onto the sleeping occupant. It was a new drill that he had instituted since Ginger's disappearance, and he was putting it into operation for the first time that night. And when the neat circle of illumination that the torch made, when in the neat circle, the illumination that the torch made, Dr. Trump saw Ginger's head upon the pillow, he was so surprised that he nearly dropped the torch. He simply stood there, staring. "Look," he said to Mr. Dawlish. "Look, man." It was the most terrible voice he was using, a voice made somehow more alarming because the words were spoken through clenched teeth. "Here, he..." Oh, sorry. It was made through clenched teeth. He wasn't here last night," Mr. Dawlish said, idiotically. "Well, he's here now," Dr. Trump replied. "Arrest him." And we've come to the end of chapter whatever it was. We're now on the next chapter, chapter 42. I guess it was chapter 41. Yeah, okay, I've got it. How are we doing? Let's have a quick look. I remember the flower sellers in Montague Place. "However grim things get, people can afford flowers," said Dudley Sawyer. Is that right? "Flowers are lovely, dear." Steve G, good afternoon. I saw the end of Covent Garden just before it was moved to 9 dials. Ah. What? 9 dials? 7 dials, don't you mean? Was it 7 dials? Delivering flower arrangements was my happiest job. Seeing so many smiles in one day was a joy. Ah, yes, I bet. "Gee whiz, Ginger is as tall as me," says the lovely Julia. Or should I say as short as me. The flower shop I used to deliver has doubled its business during COVID. Blimey. That's remarkable. Not that sweet anymore, Audrey. I've been cutting down the sugar intake. Good for you, Julia. It's going to do you in good stead. Cornetto. I call it pillow. You can call it hillo, says Dudley. And Justine Jones says, "Flowers are lovely, all nice and fresh and cheap. Do you want some, love?" Exactly. That's exactly what they said. "Flowers are lovely, all nice and fresh and cheap. Do you want some, mate? Do you want some, love? Go on, have some flowers." "Have some." "Yes, thanks. Cheers." "No, that's £5.50. No, you just said have them." I once went to the Grand Hotel in Brighton, and I was waiting to see a client, and I got in there, and this waiter came up to me and he said, "Would you like tea?" I said, "Oh, that's very kind. Yes, I'll have a cup of tea. Thank you." I sat down. This tea came on a fancy stand with cakes and stuff. I thought, this is nice. Thank you very much. Anyway, I was sitting there like this, gobbling away. He came back a while later and put down this piece of paper. I thought, I wonder what that is. I looked at it. It said £15. I said, excuse me, what's this about? He said, the bill for the tea and the cake and stuff, the tea. I said, I didn't order it. He said, I distinctly remember asking you if you wanted tea. I said, that's right. You asked me if I wanted tea. That's very kind of you. You offered me the tea. You didn't take an order. I didn't ask for it. You offered it me. There is a difference. At that point, my client arrived and he saw the haggling going on. He said, it's all right, put it on our account. The fool! The fool! Sometimes nuance on words are important. Very important. Oh. Anyway. Chapter 42. Altogether, Ginger's disappearance was the biggest event of 1930. It started Canon Mallow writing again, and the affair didn't die down immediately either. The press got hold of it, and after there'd been a lot of irritating headlines of mystery of the missing orphan and police investigate 24-hour disappearance, Variety, there were a lot more of rather nasty sinister. Did I say the words were important? Yeah. There were a whole lot more with a rather nasty, sinister tone to them, as though the press had turned against Dr. Trump. Julia says, one of these days you're going to knock that tooth right out of your mouth. I'm going to knock that tooth right out of my mouth. Yeah, one of these days. Sentence of silence. The mute orphans of Putney was how the new batch came out, and that was because Dr. Trump had imposed sentence of Coventry on the entire hospital by way of punishment. In the end, there had been a special board meeting to consider the situation. The meeting was longer than it need have been because of Miss Bodkin. She had reverted to nature this morning and was entirely instrumentless. In consequence, she heard nothing. She understood less. Even so, often a stray word, as random and unpredictable as a metaphor, would soar into her intelligence, and trouble would begin. "But why did Mr. Dawlish run away?" she asked. "Surely he wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been unhappy." Then again, "It still seems a pity to me that Dr. Trump ever wrote all those articles. If he hadn't written it, no one need ever have known what happened." But in the end, it was, as usual, Dame Eleanor's meeting. She dominated, and her summing up caused Dr. Trump to flush angrily and bite his lip. Indeed, it was only the knowledge of his hidden ace that enabled him to remain there, bitter and resentful, while Dame Eleanor proceeded. "Well, I must say, things have come to a pretty pass when boys begin running away," she said. "It'll be the girls next, and then where will we be? There's only one explanation of it all: slackness. The whole place needs tightening up." "Tightening up, I say. Tightening up. And now, those ridiculous stories in the press. If we go on like this, we shall be a public laughing-stock." A shudder of icy coldness ran right through Dr. Trump at those words. Now, if ever, was the moment for him to play the ace. And when Dame Eleanor looked up impatiently, he coughed. "There is one other matter. As the whole board is assembled, there is one other matter as the whole board is assembled," he said, keeping his eyes down on the blotting pad. Normally I should have reported it next month, but in view of its importance, I would not wish to withhold it. It is... Here Dr. Trump looked up, and the board could see that through his death, though his... Sorry. But in view of... Oh. It is... Here Dr. Trump looked up, and the board could see that, though his face was deathly pale, his eyes were blazing. The laundry has begun to show a profit. That's all he cared about. It showed a profit. It was indeed his singular triumph with laundry that provided Dr. Trump with his one consolation. For with Felicity still down at Broadstairs with Sebastian, even his home was not his own. Life at the moment was being lived upon the lap of his mother-in-law. The sight of her sitting opposite him at his own breakfast table, visibly enjoying, the first cigarette of the day, sent a shudder right through him. That, indeed, was one of her chief crudenesses. She enjoyed things too much. She'd even have a way of stirring the sugar in her teacup and scooping the marmalade onto her toast that verged positively upon the voluptuous. And more than once he watched her mentally comparing the size of the egg in his egg cup with the one of her own. Morning after morning he sat there silently hating her. But there were other qualities as well that he had not suspected. Dangerous, seductive, feminine qualities. Her high-coloured and rather puffy, as she now was, it seemed that in her youth she had been nothing less than a hunting nymph, a siren. The past revealed itself startlingly in stray sentences that popped up from nowhere. "I could sit on my hair when I was first married," she had once confided, after Dr. Trump had incautiously admitted that he was getting worried about his own. Another time, when she had arrived down to breakfast in a pink knitted jumper that Dr. Trump had carefully avoided noticing, she had suddenly remarked, "I always look my best in pink, and that's not just my opinion either. There are some others you could ask, I could tell you." Nevertheless, as the days passed, he was forced to admit that amid the cheapness, the tawdiness of her nature, there was a warmth, a geniality that dear Felicity, he had to confess, possessed simply none of it, whereas Mrs. Warple dedicated herself to him. She served, she slaved, she wooed. Her care for his comfort was overwhelming. What did he eat? What he didn't eat? Did he want quarter rubbers when he sent his shoes to be repaired? What was his shaving water hot enough in the mornings? Were there sufficient blankets on the bed at night? Why hadn't he told her that a button had come off his trousers, and that it was this that was giving him that extraordinary hitched-up, sideways look? Indeed, life on the material plane, he had to admit, was distinctly more comfortable with Mrs. Warple than it had ever been with her daughter. And it was obvious that Mrs. Warple, for her part, was enjoying herself thoroughly. With no one to gainsay her, she now exhibited a fierce technical efficiency, a kind of professional household competence that left him marvelling. Oh my, oh my. Are we still all right? Everybody happy? Time ticking on. Chapter 43. Desiree was at Deirdre Gardens at last. Had been there for nearly 6 weeks now. And They had been radiant and blissful weeks. Finding that she really had no money of her own at all, Mr. Pavarius had been suitably indulgent in a coy, would kitten like to put her paw in daddy's pocket kind of way. And kitten's paw had dived in obediently every time. In the result, kitten now had a new fur wrap, 2 complete sets of silk negligee, one coral pink and the other amber, as well as a double row of pearls so highly cultured that they would have made a Cambridge Don appear illiterate. And then, without warning, into the very midst of this first-floor idyll came the bomb, the bolt, the thunderflash. Up to the present, Mr. Pavarius had always been so careful, so circumspect about his little affairs. Stray addresses in Maida Vale or Paddington are practically untraceable and therefore innocuous. But this was different. This was so open, so obvious, so positively defiant in its boldness, and the last thing he wanted to do was to take any risks. Indeed, in his position, he could simply not afford to do so. For more than 20 years now, he'd been concealing something, keeping a dark secret hidden, successfully too. And in any case, it all had happened so long ago. Mr. Pavarius could scarcely remember the lady, certainly could not remember any motive that could possibly have induced him to marry her. She had been so genteel, at least he remembered that much, and so entirely sexless, too, in a tweedy, chilblainy kind of way. In a tweedy, chilblain, it's so, what a great description of somebody who's sexless. What a lovely term that is, in a tweedy, chilblainy kind of way. Even to remember that awful wedding night when it was only the sound of her coughing that had kept him awake at all, was to plunge again into the whole ocean of melancholy. It had been, he supposed now that he came to reflect upon it, a marriage of impulse, and, what had made it worse, restrained impulse. He had married her in order to save himself from himself. It had all taken place in Dumfries in February. After the unfortunate affair of the Dean's daughter, Mr. Pavarius had fled up north in order to escape a censure of malicious tongues, and he naturally had been lonely. He was still the Reverend Sidney Pavarius, B.D. at the time. The machinery of the church was only slowly getting into motion, and he was acting as curate to the Reverend Phineas McTuck, the Anglican vicar of St. Crispin's. It was Miss Jeanie McTuck, the second daughter, the one who wore a black bandeau around her long yellow hair and gave music lessons, whom he had married. She was tall, a good 6 inches taller than he was, with a pathetic flower-like droop to her long back, and her hands and feet, too, he discovered later, were always cold with a chill that suggested stone, metal, even ice itself, anything, in fact, except living flesh and blood. The marriage lasted until mid-August, the marriage lasted until mid-August, though even summer itself could not warm her. And then the ecclesiastical court uttered. Mr. Pavarius was suddenly in holy orders no longer. Mr. McTurk, a bearded, whiskery old thing with fierce Celtish eyes, turned him out the same night. Mr. Pavarius had been living with Jeanie's people all his time, and Jeanie herself, urged on by her fanatical parent, swore that she hated Mr. Pavarius for ever and would remain indissolubly married to him for life. It was after this lamentable upset that Mr. Pavarius had slipped south across the border alone, and after a spell in a preparatory school and another in canvassing for a popular encyclopedia, had reached Archbishop Bodkin, where Canon Mallow had been so guilelessly ready to take him in. But that was why it was so important that he should continue at the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital. His miserable salary there was enough to persuade him his miserable salary there was enough to persuade even a firm of Dumfries solicitors that he couldn't afford to make any contribution to a deserted wife. The only peril that he dreaded was that with one false move he might somehow involve the sort of scandal that would lead inevitably to resignation, if not actually towards dismissal. Then the consequences might be terrible. The solicitors might even contrive to get their hands on some of the golden earnings of Mr. Berkeley Cavendish. He had, right from the start, always been very careful as to what he should tell Desiree, and he had come to the conclusion that even so much as a hint of Jeannie McTuck would be an error. It seemed, after all, to be no point in worrying Desiree about something that was such ancient history, and so, whenever the topic of marriage cropped up, he treated the subject lightly and airily, brushing it aside and into the future somewhere. Not, of course, that Desiree was content to leave it at that. There were tears, misgivings, hesitancies. She had her good name to remember, she said. She wanted to know what kind of woman he thought she was, and was not content when he replied, "But I've told you, dear, I've told you so many times." All the same, now that she had overcome her scruples, things were going along very smoothly. The one-room flat proved to be a bit small for the two of them, largely because of the grand piano and the Buddhist altar which took up so much of the space, and Mr. Pavarius had taken the best bedroom as well. Miss Lewis's own best bedroom, in fact. Refurbished in pale blonde satin wood with strip lighting over the dressing table, it seemed somehow to provide Desiree with some solace for her own invidious position. And it was at about 7:30 one rainy Sunday morning, in this very bedroom, with the pink curtains still drawn and Desiree's silk and swan-down dressing gown draped negligently across the bed on top of Mr. Pavarius's blue-spotted one, that the incident occurred. Mr. Pavarius declared afterwards that he had heard the fatal ring at the doorbell, but he admitted, been far too sleepy to take any notice of it. In fact, had merely snatched an armful of eiderdown back from Desiree and snuggled down again. A moment later, however, all thoughts of sleep were clearly impossible. There were trampling feet on the landing outside the bedroom, and the sound of Miss Lewis's voice raised in shrill protest. Then, without even a knock upon the panel, the bedroom door was flung open, and a little man like a damp muskrat in a shabby bowler hat and brown overcoat stood there. It occurred later to Mr. Pavarius that he must have seen the man somewhere before, and he remembered dimly that he had once or twice drunk beside him in a public house at the corner, where he and Desiree used to drop in occasionally when drinking alone became tedious. The man, he now recalled, had been noticeable for the kind of sideways stare that he had kept trained upon them. But this time there was nothing at least sideways about the stare. It was one of the most straightforward stares in London, and it was directed full onto the bed. But not, it seemed, onto Mr. Pavarius himself. The trained professional eye under the shabby bowler hat had already taken in the figure with the tousled hair and saffron and magenta pyjamas, who was sitting up at the elbow, goggling at him. It was at the cluster of daffodil-coloured curls on the adjacent pillow that he was now looking, and when roused suddenly by Mr. Pavarius' indignant, "What the blue blazes?" the daffodil-coloured head appeared over the bedclothes, and Desiree showed herself, that the man in the bowler hat and the brown overcoat appeared satisfied. "Thank you very much," he said. "I've got all I need. Sorry to interrupt." And before Mr. Pavarius could reply to the man in the bowler hat and his overcoat, he had closed the door in their faces. But by then Mr. Pavarius had sprung out of bed. He was at the keyhole listening, and what he heard appalled him. Above the noise of the heavy clumping feet descending the staircase, he caught the words, "My card, needed as witness. Apologies for any unpleasantness." Blimey. And it was then, and not until then, that Mr. Pavarius suffered the greatest disillusionment of his life. His faith in the whole of human nature was rudely, callously shattered, leaving him alone and defenceless in a deceit and dishonest world. For Desiree spoke first. "Oh, well," she said, smearing some fresh lipstick on her face while she was still speaking. "If it had to happen, it's best to be got over with." Then you expected it?" Mr. Pavarius demanded. "I'm still only surprised he still bothers about me," Desiree went on. She had put down the lipstick by now and was busy on her nails with the polisher. "He must have been up to something himself, or he'd never forked up for it." "He?" Mr. Pavarius repeated in a trembling, sickly sort of voice. "You mean—" "Oh, forget it," said Desiree. "It's ancient history. We haven't seen each other for donkey's years. I suppose a girl's entitled to some secrets, isn't she?" She paused. "We were only married for about a month or so, but it's nice to know that he's been sensible about it. When I left him, he always threatened he'd murder me if I—" But Mr. Pavarius was no longer listening. Face downwards upon the bed, his face cradled in his forearm, he was crying like a child. To think that with more than 1,000,000 other girls of the right age to choose from, he should have selected and, more than selected, pursued and hounded down one who had turned out to be every bit as deceitful and contemptible as he was himself. By golly. Oh, I was going to leave it there because we're on the next chapter. The next chapter is only a page, and then we're on to book 5. So we will do this last bit. This time, it was not Ginger's fault so much as Sweetie's. This is chapter 44. But what made it so much worse was that it was the fault of the two of them together. It came indeed as the first open declaration of their joint lawlessness, and it was of no consolation to Dr. Trump to know that in a sense he had precipitated it even. It was one of his little tours. It was one of his little tours of inspection that had started it all. In the evening, and he'd got very. Oh golly, I've stopped reading. Well, what happened to me? Suddenly the words, I can't read them. Wait. It was one of his little tours of inspection that had started it all. It was evening, and he had got as far as the laundry block when he thought he heard voices, low voices, secretive voices, a girl's voice and a boy's. A sense of suspicion that expressed itself in stealth crept over him. He tiptoed up to the dispatch counter and peered in through one of the windows. And what he saw appalled him. There, seated on one of the baskets that contained tomorrow's deliveries, was Ginger, and beside him, so close that she was almost snuggling, was Sweetie. Ginger was holding her hand. No, now that he looked more closely, he could see that it was Sweetie who had hold of Ginger's. She had Ginger's hand clasped firmly in one of her own, and she was stroking it slowly, lovingly. For a moment, Dr. Trump was on the point of shattering the window pane and tearing those two loving hands apart with his fingernails. But, with an effort, he restrained himself. Evidence, complete and damning evidence, was what he now demanded, and he knew, and that he knew could be obtained only by waiting. "Why don't you like me?" Sweetie was asking. "I do," Ginger answered. And Dr. Trump was glad, positively glad, to see that the wretched boy was endeavouring to remove his hand from the smaller, fondling one that encircled it. "Then why don't you ever answer any of my letters?" Letters? A clandestine correspondence? Was it possible? But already Ginger was speaking again. "I've got too much to do," he replied. Also a good attitude, Dr. Trump decided. Ginger was showing up astonishingly well in the face of such temptation. Perhaps all those canings had done something to him. If you really like me, you'd find time," Sweetie persisted. "That is, if you really did." "Wouldn't be any good," Ginger told her. "They'd only be stopped." "Well, I seem to find a way, don't I?" Sweetie pointed out to him. "And if you could, if you wanted to, you could bring them to me at night. You did once, remember?" But Dr. Trump had had enough, and already he had decided. Because he could not trust himself to confront them face to face, he would take other measures. Sweetie and Ginger were both approximately 14 by now, and in the morning he would send them both packing. As their spiritual as well as their physical garden, he saw clearly that it was his plain duty to put the greatest possible distance between the two of them. Dr. Trump wasted no time. He told them that same night of his decision. Normally, he said they would have remained at the Archbishop Bodkin Hospital until the end of term. As it was, however, he was making arrangements for them to leave immediately, to begin life's business upon the morrow, in fact. And, because of the Admiral Card Index system that he had instituted, it was wonderfully simple. Everything was down there in black and white. It was a butcher's in Hoxton, in which Ginger was going. As for Sweetie, she would have been very satisfactorily fixed up in a Finchley rectory with 4 children, an invalid wife, and no other help. The rectory had been delighted, yes, positively delighted, he told her, when he had heard that Sweetie could come at once. And there we leave it, for we get on to Book 5, The Runaways. And I can't tell you what happens there because you'll have to wait till tomorrow. Thank you very much. Book 5, The Runaways. How about that? And we got it in before 5 o'clock. Superb. That's the way we like it. God, it's almost planned, this, isn't it? It's almost as if it's been specially weaven together in some magical way. Ooh, they're a match. I thought he would have one of those cameras with a huge flash lamp. Yes, that would have been good, wouldn't it? One of these days you're going to know. Oh, yes, read that. Brilliant. So anyway, there we are. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're still there, by the way. Lots of tension, says Michael White. Marvellous stuff. Look after yourselves this afternoon. Back again for a Vobe show at 8 o'clock. Until then, take care. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Glad you enjoyed it. Lots of thumbs up, please. And I will see you next time. All the best, and thank you for watching. It's good, isn't it? It's good. Bye-bye for now.